you so much for showing up today. We're really excited to have Greg Lukianoff talking about the battle for free speech on college campuses. I think this talk really gets to the heart of uncomfortable learning, where at other colleges we wouldn't be able to have this program because of social honor codes or other formal structures that really prevent free speech. I think we're all trying to encourage a greater dialogue and ability to promote intellectual engagement, and this talk is really getting at what are the structures that enable us to have those conversations. And so we're really excited to have Greg speak with us tonight. Thank you.
My name is Greg Lukianoff. I'm the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. I'm a specialized First Amendment lawyer, and I was a little bit weird in my decision to go to law school in that I went specifically to do First Amendment free speech law. Both my parents are immigrants. I grew up in a household with a Russian father and a British mom, both who had very strong ideas about what you should and should not be allowed to say. My mother believed you should never say anything impolite, and my father would say, politeness is a form of deception. So it was actually pluralism that got me into freedom of speech. It was growing up in an immigrant neighborhood that got me into freedom of speech. Because the one thing we could all agree on was that there was something to be learned from hearing each other out. So this has been a passion of mine my entire life. And when I got to study the law, it did not let me down. This is one of my favorite quotes from First Amendment opinion. This comes from a 1943 opinion. It was in the middle of World War II, and the Supreme Court decided, and this was not a popular decision, that it was unconstitutional to require kids to salute the flag and say the Pledge of Allegiance. We were facing potential extinction at the hands of the Nazis and the Japanese Empire, and I mean that. What people miss sometimes is that intellectuals in the 1930s and 40s thought that American democracy was not long for this world, and the number of countries that were still democracies as of 1941 were very few. So there was sort of an intellectual belief that our system was not really long for this world, and that these ideas like freedom of speech were quaint and cute and passé and ultimately what's going to get us killed. But that's one of the reasons why I think of this as such a brave opinion, because in the face of public desire to silence unpatriotic children, in this case it was Jehovah's Witnesses children who said that it was against their religion to force them to salute the flag, the Supreme Court said, no, that's not who we are. This is not, and even if this is what the tougher guys are doing, even if this is what the Stalinists and the Nazis are doing, this is the last thing we give up. And I love this quote, because it's poetry. But, and the most famous part of it is, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official high or petty can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, or force citizens to confess by word or act their faith therein. If there are any circumstances which permit an exception, they do not now occur to us. That's some powerful shit in the middle of a war. But I really like the clarifying power of the first line, though. Freedom to differ is not limited to things that do not matter much. That would be a mere shadow of freedom. I like it because it's just so clear. It just points out that, and I see this happen a lot on college campuses these days, where, and for my entire career, where it seems as if people are saying, oh, I believe in free speech, unless we're talking about something really important. And I think our society, to a degree, has developed this idea. So there's so many things that are hopeful about the Barnett opinion. One of them is that as of 1925, the First Amendment starts getting interpreted in a strong way under Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis. This is really the beginning, and I can explain why it took until 1925, but that's a longer discussion right there. But in my opinion, this was the road to progress. This was an early step on the road to a proper understanding of what freedom of speech should have meant all along, or what the First Amendment should have meant all along. And it wasn't too long before this rationale was extended to universities. Now, talk about strong language. This is a case from the Red Scare from the 1950s called Sweezy v. New Hampshire. And it's among a series of cases over about 2 decades involving what can the state do to compel or root out communist sympathizers within the academy. And the Supreme Court put some serious roadblocks in the way. But they said it, they put it in what I consider both common sense and both poetic language. Teachers and students must always remain free to inquire, to study, and to evaluate, to gain new maturity and understanding. Otherwise, our civilization will stagnate and die. Strong language, but also what I think is at stake. I think that what the Supreme Court sees and what I see is that the vitality of a nation depends on its ability to speak within itself, to be innovative, to question itself, to be constructive. And the Supreme Court understood that and articulated it in such beautiful prose in the Sweezy opinion. So I'm about to show you the most offensive slide I'm going to show all night. So by the 1970s, freedom of speech was so well established on college campuses that when this is a student named Barbara Papish. She was, again, there's going to be some strong language in this occasionally. She was part of a group called Up Against the Wall Motherfuckers, a very 1960s radical group. And according to Papish, Barbara Papish, her group was beaten up by police officers. But then those police officers were acquitted. And in response to this, she ran a cartoon of police officers raping the Statue of Liberty. Strong stuff. But when it got in front of the Supreme Court, the idea that it was offensive was met with the exact right response. It was supposed to be offensive. We're fighting this out. That's the whole point. I was actually trying to anger them. That was the entire point. This is a deadly serious argument about police brutality, about the treatment of dissenters. I don't have to play nice in it. And the opinion, there was no problem figuring out that this speech was protected on college campuses. And I gotta tell you, if you tried to run this cartoon on the modern campus today, you'd be really risking it. And what's amazing is this is still good law. This is still the controlling law of the land, that even this is of course protected. It's actually protected because it's offensive. Now, this is what I deal with on a more daily basis. And we were just talking about this case. Is anybody familiar with this book? Well, obviously it's called Notre Dame versus the Klan. It's about the defeat of the Klan when they marched on Notre Dame in 1924. Sometimes people forget that the Klan was pretty sort of equal opportunity in its contempt for different people, and they also hated Catholics. So the Klan tried to march on Notre Dame in 1924, and this book celebrates the fact that Notre Dame students got together and defeated them in a street fight. It celebrates that. Now, the fact that it's an anti-racist book doesn't make it any more or less protected. It just makes what happens next that much more ironic. Because an employee at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, saw this book, saw the rally on the cover, and by the way, that's an actual picture of the rally when they marched on Notre Dame, and the burning crosses. The employee was offended. They did not bother talking to the student who was reading the book. By the way, this book is available at the IUPUI student library. He was found guilty of racial harassment without a hearing. And as bad as that is, and obviously, if you look at Papish and look at the law, this is obviously protected speech. You can read offensive books on campus. Actually, you're kind of supposed to read challenging books on campus. But as bad as this case is, and the fact that it took the combined effort of fire, the ACLU, and the Wall Street Journal to get this university to back down, that's terrible. This is not a close call in terms of the law. But what's worse about it, and what scares me more than anything else, is that when he went to go talk to professors about whether or not he should stand up for his rights and his clearly established First Amendment rights, they said, don't bother. What scares me is that students did not come to this student's defense. A previous generation of students hearing that someone was found guilty of reading a book in public would have literally rioted. And this bleeds out in really peculiar ways. Now, I think the standard argument that people want to hear about what's happened to our campuses, depending on your political point of view, is sometimes people just want it's just political correctness run amok. It's just groupthink. It's just too many people who agree with each other wanting to enforce their point of view. That's not all that's happening. A big chunk of what's going on campuses is the unleashing of hordes of administrators. And this is, to put this in perspective, within your own lifetimes, the number in 2005, hopefully none of you are younger than 9. Within your own lifetime, the number of administrators on college campuses, of full-time administrators, outstripped the number of full-time professors as of 2005, and that's on average for schools all over the country. And that trend line has only gotten worse over the years. Universities are increasingly administration heavy, and what do? They regulate practically everything. And that's how you end up with codes like this. This is University of Cincinnati, and they were telling students by the time we got involved for years, we first brought this to their attention way back in 2007, that they had what they called a free speech zone on campus. It was 0.1% of campus. It's that little end of the point on the push pin. The green push pin itself is actually about 20 times bigger than the actual free speech zone. And not only did they limit free speech and protests and handing out newspapers on campus to that tiny little area, you had to get 10 days advance permission to even use that little tiny area. So we're being nice. We're telling the university for years that this is unconstitutional, and we're getting contemptuous letters back saying, nuh-uh, no, it's not, which is, of course, laughable because it so clearly is. So we worked with some students, and they tried to get a ballot initiative signed on campus. A ballot initiative that had to be signed within a couple days, so they wanted to get it signed. They didn't want to be limited to the ridiculous, dinky little free speech zone. They knew they didn't have to be. And they asked, and they put the university on notice about this. They said, listen, we're going to petition our government for redress of grievances. We want to do this as free people. What do you say about that? Their response was that if these students were seen walking around campus, they would be arrested for trespass. Now, as bad as this case is, again, what horrifies me about it more than this happening, and this pisses me off plenty, don't get me wrong, is the fact that a state lawyer, that the University General Counsel thought it was a good idea that when the university got sued for this, that it was good to defend this code in court. I don't understand what the motivation is for a federally paid lawyer to demand that 99.9% of public campuses be non-free speech zones. And these things are not uncommon. And by the way, when this got in front of a judge, he did a spit take, basically. This got defeated as soon as it got in front of a court, and we'd been telling them that for years. So this, again, not a close call. And I want to point out that this stuff is happening today. This is happening right now. Modesto Junior College, anybody familiar with this case? Modesto Junior College in Modesto, California, a student thought his administration was so heavy-handed, was so out of control, that he basically bet himself that he couldn't even hand out copies of the Constitution on Constitution Day, which is September 17th. And not 10 minutes before he went out to try to hand out copies of the Constitution on campus to celebrate Constitution Day, in the open part of campus, in the open part of the quad, a police officer, a campus police officer, not a real police officer, comes up to him and says that he can't, that he has to be a registered student group, that he has to go to the tiny little free speech zone, that he needs advanced state permission in order to hand out constitutions on Constitution Day. So he's a nice kid. So he goes and talks to a member of the clerical staff, seen there, and she immediately starts going through this huge folder to figure out if he's allowed to and when he can use the tiny little free speech zone on campus. Turns out he can't hand out constitutions on Constitution Day because it's already booked, but he can maybe in a couple days, and if he's not available during that narrow time frame, he could probably hand them out sometime in October. And again, this school was willing to go to court to defend their right to so badly misinterpret the First Amendment. Something's gone very wrong here. And just to really bring the point home, it's not like they're winning these cases. This is just a selection of the cases universities have lost over the years defending campus speech codes. And speech zones are a kind of speech code. ridiculous and overbroad restrictions on freedom of speech that have come into vogue since the 1980s. Every single time they are challenged, they are defeated. They were defeated first at University of Michigan. I'm going to talk about when they were defeated at University of Connecticut. They were defeated at my alma mater, Stanford Law School. Even though it's a private school, there was a state law that actually imposed First Amendment standards on Stanford and other non-sectarian schools in California. And just again and again, every single time these are challenged, they are defeated. Yet nonetheless, they remain on campus. And they remain the rule, not the exception. We have a full-time lawyer on staff who evaluates the codes for, at this point, around 430 colleges around the country. She's incredibly meticulous. I can't think of anybody I'd trust more to do this. And this is what she found in our most recent study. That 58.6% of universities we evaluate maintain what we call red light speech codes. That is codes that would be, to put it simply, are laughably unconstitutional. Now, interestingly, I usually wait for this to come up in questions, but just to review it really quickly, private versus public colleges. Private colleges are bound by the First Amendment. They're not allowed to have speech codes. Private colleges are not bound by the First Amendment. They do not have to guarantee free speech rights, but FIRE's position when it comes to private schools is if you do promise free speech rights, which Williams does, the overwhelming majority of liberal arts colleges do, you should deliver and you should get at least as much free speech at those colleges that you've been told you will get it as you do it at a public college. But what's interesting about this number, this 58.6, is even though the legal obligations of public and private schools are very different, it's around the same number for public and private schools. It's around, I think it's maybe 57% of private schools have red light speech codes. And okay, so you saw how many times these codes have been defeated. You've seen how much bad press they can generate for universities. And the fact that it's 58.6 is an absolute scandal. But keep in mind that that's an improvement. When we first started doing the survey, it was 75% of universities retained red light speech codes. And there's been lawsuit after lawsuit after, we have something called the Speech Code of the Month program at FIRE. And that can be very embarrassing because universities have codes like this. I picked this one just because it's just so raw. No student shall offend anyone on university or operated property. Now, it's just so pure. It's just saying you have a right not to be offended. If you offend somebody, you're guilty. And what scares me is I feel like more than a generation of students have grown up with such ridiculous codes in K through 12 that they look at this and they go, oh, that doesn't sound that bad. And then I have to remind them, every single one of you have violated this code. You do not want to leave it up to administrators to assumedly have you all guilty and then just leave it up to their good graces to not find you guilty. That is misplaced trust. That's not the way power dynamics should work. And again, these kind of codes, laughed out of court. You cannot say that you can't offend anybody. That is considered both vague and overbroad. That will not stand a second in a court of law. But this one's my favorite one because it says so many different things about speech codes. So way back in the early heyday of speech codes, say like circa 1990, University of Connecticut passes a speech code that includes a ban on derogatory names, inconsiderate jokes, and inappropriately directed laughter. Vague, broad, every single one of you have violated this code at some point or another, at least as far as power is concerned. And this was defeated at University of Connecticut in a court of law in 1991. It was also laughed at in the local newspapers. It was laughed at nationally. Maybe it was inappropriately directed as far as they were concerned. But it was defeated, and ignominiously so. But nonetheless, it was resuscitated in its full text by Drexel University 9 years later. And we only defeated it in 2006. So the only way this university could have found out about this code, to my knowledge, would be reading about this ridiculous code that got defeated at University of Connecticut, and then saying to themselves, hey, that sounds like a great idea. Let's pass that at Drexel. So we had to defeat this code again. Watch where you laugh. And so this gets me to sort of like one of the deeper points of the book. Now, I've been doing this for a long time, and and as I said, I went to law school specifically to do First Amendment law, and free speech is a passion of mine. I think it's necessary to a thriving democracy. I think it's necessary to clear and cogent thinking. I think it's necessary to innovative thinking. And I think it's one of the great innovations that we've come up with in human history for things including peace and pluralism. But when I first started writing the book on learning liberty, campus censorship and the end of American debate, I got some questions that kind of disturbed me a little bit. One of my editors, who was amazed at all the horrifying cases he'd seen from FIRE, asked me, yeah, okay, people get in trouble for silly things on college campuses. Yeah, and some of them are pretty serious cases. Someone can have their career ruined in some cases. Other times they're slap on the wrist, and so what if their free speech rights are violated? Why does this matter? I found that a kind of chilling question because for a previous generation, there was absolutely no doubt that this mattered. Stagnate and die is not weak language. But I started looking into how this affects students, how this climate affects students. And while I was working on the book, this huge study comes out that asks students. It's the American Association of Colleges and Universities. They asked this incredibly soft question. And this is the kind of question that you ask in order to get 100% of people saying, there's nothing to see here, there's no problem. This is the way you word a question if you want to get 100% good answers. Is it safe to hold unpopular positions on your campus? If you really wanted to know the answer to that, is it safe to challenge people on controversial issues? Is it safe to challenge your professors? Is it safe to engage in thought experimentation? Is it safe to engage in devil's advocacy? The things that are really at the heart of meaningful, serious discussion. But instead they worded it, is it safe to merely hold unpopular positions on your campus? This is the kind of question that you would expect 100% of students to come back and say, well, sure, it's safe to hold them. And I think that's what the AACU was expecting. But they got a little bit of a surprise. First years, only 40% of first-year students strongly agree with the statement that it is safe to merely hold unpopular points of view on campus. And then look what happens. Every single year they're there, it gets worse. By the time they're freshmen, by the time they're seniors, it's only 30% of students. And guess who's the most pessimistic about whether or not it's safe to hold unpopular positions on campus? Faculty. Yeah. Almost half of the worst number. Only 16.7% of faculty strongly agree with the statement that it is safe to hold unpopular points of view on campus. Something wrong has happened here. And I'm not saying this is just the result of speech codes, but I do think that they're related. And this is one of the reasons why I think you probably haven't heard that much about this problem, and why it's not viewed as much as a problem. Because as I go onto campuses, I think that the reimagining of free speech as not being something that is necessary to protect the rights of minorities, the rights of people whose voices aren't otherwise heard, which is why you need it, by the way. In a democracy, just some basic stuff that sometimes needs to be said. In a democracy, the majority voice is protected by the vote. You don't need a separate protection of freedom of speech to protect the voice of the majority. By definition, the First Amendment exists to protect the voices of minorities, the voices of the people who aren't in the majority. But somewhere in the, and there are certain philosophers that you could point to for this, but I think it was also just a trend that I could talk your ear off about that I call sort of problems of comfort and sort of working towards the post-materialist society in the 1970s. That you end up with this sort of flipping on its head that free speech is not enough. We actually have to practice what Herbert Marcuse called repressive tolerance in order to really have this beautiful utopia that we're all hopefully heading towards. I think that's incredibly naive and wrong-headed and dangerous, but I do think it's had some success. And I think that really what universities do a lot of is they focus a lot on that one time that you dislike what someone says, and completely ignore the 10,000 times every freaking day that you actually benefit from freedom of speech, whether it's through innovations or just knowing what people actually think. But I think they've been pretty successful in this sort of discrediting of freedom of speech among the citizenry. And so that was a theory, and definitely this is not definitive evidence here, but just this past summer, the First Amendment Center, which does this survey every year, asked citizens this question: does the First Amendment go too far? And last year was the worst year they'd had since 9/11. 34% of Americans, huge spike up, believe that the First Amendment goes too far. Now, interestingly, this doesn't actually line up. Sometimes people bring up Citizens United. This doesn't actually line up very well with Citizens United. What it does line up with is the Boston bombing, which scares me even more. Because if you've convinced people that the reason why people are blowing up car bombs is because of freedom of speech, you're not learning that actually freedom of speech was one of the greatest innovations for peace. The whole idea of freedom of speech is that you argue it out. You don't blow up things and you don't kill people over their differences of opinion. So, but this is even worse than it looks. When you tease it out, it's as I said, for the entire sample size, it's 34%. But if you tease it out according to age groups, people over the age of 60, none of them think the First Amendment goes too far, practically. In the middle age groups, it gets a little bit more pessimistic as you get closer to 30. But when you get to the ages of 18 to 30, 47% of people believe that it was the worst age group of any age group. And to me, this is incredibly ironic, because 18 to 30-year-olds benefit from freedom of speech more than anybody. Oftentimes they enjoy the video games that are protected by it, they enjoy the comedians that are protected by it, they enjoy the music that's protected by it. And to actually have pulled this one over on students that actually free speech they're not that interested on, I think is a great generational bamboozlement. So one of the reasons why I think that why people don't hear as much about these problems as they should is because it's really, really easy to never need fire's help. Fire defends, if I didn't explain it entirely, fire defends students and faculty on campuses when they're in trouble for free speech or due process violations. But there are 4 things you can do to never need our help. Don't talk to people you disagree with. Don't disagree with faculty members whose egos can't take it. Join ideological groups that reflect what you believed in high school, and generally avoid controversial topics in the first place. Wonderful. You follow those 4 things and you're not going to get in trouble. But there's something very wrong with that. If that's what you're doing, why do we have universities in the first place? And also, that's already what our entire society is already doing. There's a wonderful book called The Big Sort that talks about how increasingly, not only do we listen to Fox News or MSNBC or only NPR or go to the websites that reflect what we already believe, we increasingly live in neighborhoods that look exactly like us in terms of ideology. And it's getting worse. It's getting more dramatic right down to the actual county and neighborhood and block of your street that we're increasingly glomming together in like-minded cliques. So this is a problem that I don't think universities caused. It is actually, but at the same time, it's a problem that universities could really be helping. They could really be helping us talk across lines of political difference. But they are nowhere near solving that problem if you can get in trouble for having the wrong debate or the wrong opinion on a college campus. They're doing the exact opposite. They're reinforcing this. And there was one last piece of data that I found that I really want to get more on, is that there is an inverse correlation between the amount of education you have and the number of political disagreements that you have in an average month. Now let me tease that out. And it's a pretty straight line. That if you have a high school education, you have more political disagreements than someone who has a college education. And if you have a college education, you have more political disagreements than someone who has a master's. And the person who has the fewest political disagreements in a month is someone who has their PhD. Now, there's a human nature aspect to this, where kind of like, yeah, okay, you're more upwardly mobile, you can live in communities, and you'll choose communities that share your values, and that's a nice way of saying you choose communities that look a lot more like you, that sound a lot more like you, and that's understandable. But I think that one of the cultural fixes to this is that I don't think you should ever be allowed to call yourself educated or an intellectual unless you see it as a duty to seek out the intelligent person with whom you disagree. That used to be considered the defining aspect of what it meant to be an educated person. It should become so again. When you realize that the person you're talking to only listens to people that they agree with, you should probably find someone else to talk to or try to convince them that they need to talk to more people. This echo chamber effect is poisonous, and it's one of these things in the social science, as far as things that experiment after experiment they do, is that when you get like-minded people together and have them only talk to other like-minded people, they tend to become a lot more radical in what they believe, and they start adopting really bizarre, and in some cases hateful opinions of the people who disagree with them. And universities should not be contributing to this negative intellectual cycle. So, before I get to questions, I want to give you guys some homework, since I'm on campus. There's going to be 3 copies of the book, as long as you promise to read it. They're not here right now, but as long as people promise to read it, you know, there's 3 copies of the book that for you to check out. But also, if you want to buy it, all royalties go to FIRE. Once again, the name of that book is Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of American Debate. Join FIRE's student network. There's going to be we're going to be asking people to sign up for it. There's T-shirts involved. You get a free FIRE T-shirt. And check out your school's policies at thefire.org. I know Williams is on there. I'm pretty sure it's a red light. I haven't reviewed their code.
Williams is yellow.
Williams is yellow. Oh, good. Sorry. Okay, congratulations. Yellow's actually pretty good. Thanks. But here's the harder part. Make it a lifelong habit to seek out smart people with whom you disagree. By the fact that this lecture series was put together, that shows some evidence that you already believe that. But also note the censorship instinct, the desire to grandstand, and the ease with which individuals claim offense. There's been a lot of great articles just in the past, particularly after the Colbert thing, the cancel Colbert thing. But Key and Peele and Patton Oswalt and other comedians coming out saying, I'm calling BS on this. You're not actually offended. People are getting a little bit they're enjoying the spotlight a little bit too much, and the power that claiming offense at the lowest possible setting can gain them, and it's making us unbearable as a society. The idea of getting this sort of old-fashioned idea of hear the person out, and honestly, it's okay to say that I don't really think you're really that upset, has to be something that's okay to say again. Because in some cases, honestly, Bill Maher wrote a great piece called "Can we have a I'm not offended day nationally?" And it's funny because it came out of a situation where Rush Limbaugh did say something offensive. He called Sandra Fluke a slut, and then he apologized for it. But then pundits on the right went after Bill Maher for saying equally horrible things, if not more horrible things, about Sarah Palin. But it really met its silly crescendo when at a fundraiser, Robert De Niro made a joke about Callista Gingrich. And he mentioned her and he said, but really people, are we really ready for a white first lady? It's a cute joke. And Newt Gingrich went on air demanding that Robert De Niro apologize for that highly offensive joke. And that was what the cause of Bill Maher writing this. He was just like, no, nobody means this. This is play acting. This is ridiculous. But one thing that he didn't point out in that is I do think that a lot of these bad rhetorical habits get particularly sharpened on campuses. I don't think there's anywhere where people are more easily offended than on the modern college campus. The next one is ask yourself if you're reducing people with whom you disagree with to caricatures of societal evil. I see this happen on campuses all the time. And remember that arguments that make us the most uncomfortable are often the ones we most badly need to have. Anybody who's ever been in a romantic relationship has certainly learned this one. So, in conclusion, that's my contact information. As Alan Charles Kors once put it, that a nation that does not educate in liberty will not endure in liberty and will not even know when it's lost. I'm happy to take questions.
So like, I think one of the points that's most scary about all this is that like at a school like Williams, where you have a student body that's here to learn, but is also like very, I think, happy to get through with a great education, 4 years.
Sure.
Kind of keep heads down and then go off into the workplace. How do you compel people? I mean, how do you emphasize the importance of all this?
It's really hard because, and I do honestly think that when you're paying the obscene amount of $60,000 a year, for some of these places, I don't know, probably Williams is somewhere around there, that I think that does create a little bit more of a keep your head down kind of mentality because you got a lot at stake. And that's one of the reasons why I think universities have fallen down so badly. It really shouldn't be just on you guys. I think Oxford-style debates should be part of orientation. And they shouldn't be about like the food plan or recycling on campus. They should be about global warming and the existence of God. Like you should have some serious debates when you get to campus. But universities have gone really very much the other direction. And there's some there are some fairly commendable instincts behind it in some cases, wanting to make a place welcoming and nice and all this kind of stuff. But I do get annoyed sometimes when people just talk about the commendable aspects of it. It's not just commendable. It's also, give me your money, get through the 4 years. I don't get paid the student loans unless you actually make it through all the way, or you can make it through 3 years and I still get just about as much. There is a little bit of sort of give us your check, and the quality of education, the amount of critical thinking skills that are actually produced on college campuses. The biggest study called Academically Adrift that's been done about this showed miserable results, and I talk about that in the book as well. And one of them is, since every university, there's not a lot that every university agrees on that's part of their goal, but one of them is that they need to to help students develop critical thinking skills. And critical thinking skill, and it's nice that it's very universal. But in the entire scope of this study of Academically Adrift, only something like 45% of students showed no development of improvement in critical thinking skills over the entire scope of the study. Now, and think about that. We're talking about 18 to in the scope of the study, 18 to 20-year-olds. A normal 18 to 20-year-olds working at a Denny's would be expected to show some improvement in critical thinking skills during that time. And the idea that 45% of them showed none means that really it sounds more like that you'd have to hold people back in order to produce such dismal results. But one of the most telling things in that study was the fact that students didn't know, and this is part of what they're evaluated on, how to make what was referred to as make or break an argument, which means you're given a proposition. Okay, argue the side you like. Okay, they could do that. Argue the side you don't like. They couldn't do that. And to me, that's partially because we've encouraged an environment where people don't have these fun disagreements, where they don't actually get to the meaty stuff. And a lot of that education actually took place in the dormitories. Sometimes it could be a little ugly, sometimes it could be a little rude, but it could be fun and it could be productive. But when you create an environment where you can actually get in trouble for engaging in that, then you're actually you're undermining one of the ways that you help produce critical thinking skills. So I mean, to me, like having an Oxford-style debate at the very beginning of college, I think would help a lot. But universities are so far away from wanting to do that. They are so far away from wanting to do that. That would not be peace and quiet on their watch. And some administrators, that's what they want. Sure.
I remember after the Colbert thing, I read an article by some columnist in some Chicago newspaper, I think. And he was basically, he wrote sort of along the lines of like, I am like very, very offended. Like I am very, very like, this is something that's like a huge problem in society. I should not be able to say things like this. And I was like reading more about him as an author, and he said he was a follower of this, I don't know if it's like a thought, like a well-known thought process, but it was called like radical empathy. Where like it's like
Radical empathy?
Radical empathy.
Got it. I was trying to.
I put them together. But it was sort of like people shouldn't tell me what I'm thinking, and I am actually extremely offended, and I'm offended for like
Right.
everybody in my like social group that was made a comment on.
Right.
Do you think that attitude is like dangerous or?
I think it's unhealthy. Let's put it that way. I'm probably one of the only like First Amendment people who mentions any amount of Buddhism in his speeches, but I do think it's crucial because one of the noble truths of Buddhism is that life is pain. And one of the great secrets of the noble truth that life is pain is that as soon as you actually recognize that life is pain, life becomes a lot less painful. And that's something I'm an atheist. I make no bones about that either, but I do study Buddhism. And as far as actually useful knowledge that I've learned in my life, that has helped me tremendously. I think it's psychologically healthy to understand that. I think that it's helped a lot of people throughout their lives to understand, wait a second, this pain that I'm experiencing, it's a common part of the human experience, and it's normal, and this is what we deal with every day, so much so that there's a philosophy where the first truth is that life is pain. If you create the expectation that life is not pain, and that every time something painful happens to you, it's got to be someone else's fault or something wrong and terrible has happened, you are dooming that person to, in my opinion, ultimately what is a psychologically unhealthy state. And if that's actually the way you're teaching students to engage with the world, there is no cave in which they can hide to get away from pain. And that's one of the reasons why I think you end up having this, the offensiveness bar gets lower and lower and lower. Because when you make the bar for what can be stopped because it's offensive be the key, then people start realizing, but that kind of hurts too, and that kind of hurts too. What you need people to be able to say is that this is what freedom of speech is what we did, was an innovation that helped us replace actual violence and combat. It's gonna hurt sometimes, and actually sometimes that pain is actually fairly good for you. But if you create the expectation that you can escape from this world without the daily abrasions of everyday life and without hurt feelings, you're saying that either you're telling someone that they should choose not to live. So I do think that there's something deeply psychologically unhealthy about it. Sir.
I recently made a highly offensive post on our discussion board at the school, and just as an abstract hypothetical, how easy would it be to get that republished if I were to, send some threats about you guys and lawyers and stuff like that? It was taken out because someone found it disturbing.
Well, we don't so much legally threaten,
Right.
and it also.
Yeah.
It also just depends on the speech. It also depends on the forum. Definitely kind of like you have greater, for example, if it's in a classroom, a professor has greater ability to control it. Actually, the free speech rights in that sense are an academic freedom largely attached to the ability of professors. But if you don't mind my ask, what did you write?
It was clearly ironic. I was accused of a hate crime.
Oh. You shouldn't do that.
It was, that was pretty surprising. So I wrote a clearly ironic hate letter if I were to write this hate crime against Africans. Someone found this disturbing, so it was taken down.
Yeah, people, I mean, parody and satire, you do at your own risk these days. And how easy, and when I talk about things that it's easy to get in trouble for, the parody and satire is right at the top of the list. The problem is if anything sounds threatening, the problem with the threats doctrine is that it makes so much sense in that if someone could reasonably argue that they reasonably felt like you were actually threatening somebody, then that actually counts as threats even in well-established law. Now, of course, I'll give you an example of one where this argument was stretched out of all recognition, and it's happening right now. We have a case at Bergen Community College where a professor put up a picture of his daughter, like 5-year-old daughter, she's doing like a yoga position, wearing a Game of Thrones t-shirt that's from Daenerys Targaryen, and I forget what the full quote is, but it's something like, I will take my kingdom back and the final lines are, with blood and fire. Universities are so hyper reactive to this stuff that, and also in this case, they're such Luddites. An administrator got an email from Google Plus that he got any times this professor put up pictures, but thought it was an email to him, saw blood and fire on the kid's t-shirt and immediately suspended the student. The professor. And now he's being sent to mandatory psychological counseling. So like these cases are,
They suggested psychological counseling for me, but it's not mandatory yet.
Yeah, well, let's stay in touch. Let's put it that way. We also had one case involving a quote from the show Firefly. The threats doctrine has been bent out of all recognition on campuses, and so like almost as ridiculous, but a different, but one that I always feel like should be called out. Another school in Ohio, Sinclair College in Ohio, told students that they couldn't have protest signs anywhere on campus. And so students were like, okay, I mean, we can't have the sticks to hold the signs. Maybe they think we're going to poke each other's eyes out, or something, which is ridiculous to begin with. But so they tried to comply. So they got rid of the sticks and they held up posters. They were told, nope, no holding up posters. Those are also signs. Sure, of course, yeah. And when we wrote the university president of Sinclair College, he wrote back saying, well, Virginia Tech and 9/11. Yeah, exactly. And it's just like, and I used to have him as part of my slideshow every time because I wanted everybody to know that someone invoked Virginia Tech and 9/11 in order to ban protest signs on campus. It's amazing the stuff they'll pull out, and it would be considered hysterical by a previous generation, but unfortunately it's fact these days. Ben.
What's happened to all the activists who used to be so vocal? I mean, where have they all gone?
What's happened to all the activists who used to be so vocal? Definitely there are some old school ACLU people who adore fire. Nat Hentoff, but Nat Hentoff is like 88. Like we're doing an interview with him. We're going to be posting that fairly soon. Freedom of speech is not the hot, sexy issue it once was on college campuses, like in the 60s and 70s. And I think it partially comes from, like I said, a long period of sort of portraying freedom of speech as actually being the bad guy. Now, people will, sort of the trump card that people will pick on against freedom of speech is that freedom of speech also protects racist speech. And that's true. But what I think people don't quite get is that, and where we started going down the wrong path, is we started evaluating what we think of, we started evaluating speech on terms of how good or bad we think it is. That's not the point. The point is to know what people actually say and think. And so when people are saying that we're going to address racism or sexism by making it illegal to express those opinions on campus, I mean, first of all, I think that's hopelessly naive. But it also creates two different kinds of distortions. One distortion is that it can lead to leaders saying, look, I've solved racism because I've made it illegal. Sort of this Panglossian kind of idea that basically you can fix something just by saying no. You can't do that anymore. The second one, which I actually think is more prevalent on college campuses, is and there's a great book by African-American scholar John L. Jackson called Racial Paranoia, that talks about how these kind of codes can actually encourage people to believe that people are much worse than they actually are. That essentially we need these codes because this community is so racist that without them, anytime someone left the room, it would just be filled with racist vitriol. And I think that both distortions happen, but I think when you actually let people talk, even when they say horrible things. Now, here's the thing. It's really valuable to know if someone in your class is a racist. It's really valuable, as my friend, as FIRE founder Harvey Silverglade, who's Jewish, would say. It's like I kind of want to know if there's Nazis in the room. This is important information. It's important to figure out why they believe it. It helps you address it. And when you actually, and I also have, I'm more when it comes to sort of the different spectrums. I'm a little bit more of a populist than an elitist. Actually, sorry, I'm way more of a populist than an elitist. And I think that what you'll be surprised about is, people will bring up Fred Phelps as like the example of someone whose speech should never be allowed. But if you actually ever went to one of his rallies, the counter-protesters outnumbered Fred Phelps like 500 to 1. It wasn't that suddenly like people showed up and said, this Fred Phelps guy has a great idea. Where do I sign up? It was actually a way of it actually, to a degree, brought people who totally disagreed on different issues together. But it also showed that we can be trusted with freedom of speech. So I think we're thinking about it wrong. I think we're thinking about freedom of speech wrong, and I can sort of pin down sort of the philosophical error that was made in it. Might as well say this. The discovery of truth was always considered to be sort of like the main rationale for freedom of speech. It's not the only rationale, I don't even think it's the main one. But because this got into the hands of academics, you start having this sort of reinterpretation of it being the discovery of objective truth, the discovery of Platonic truth, the discovery of like the form of the square is essentially the only reason why we have freedom of speech. But because we now know everything's subjective and truth is unknowable, and that's of course a debatable topic too, then free speech doesn't matter because everything's equally subjective. This is like the dumbest argument I've ever heard. And it's actually said with a straight face in paper after paper I read because they're confusing what I call big T truth and small t truth. Big T truth, the idea that kind of like the potentially unknowable, what is the form of beauty, fine. And if that's all freedom of speech is good for, then maybe you have a point. But really what freedom of speech is good for are these small t truths. And this is what its value was with the printing press. This is how much rice costs in the other village. This means Andy's really mad at Jerry. This is how much we're building a moat. Kind of like all of these like these little tiny things like this movie didn't do very well. All of these little tiny bits of information is why the information, why the explosions in information technology have such huge benefits. It's not because we're all transmitting the objective truth to each other. It's all that we just have a better understanding of the world in which we actually live and what people are saying and thinking, and also, frankly, what's thinkable. So I have time for one more question. Sir.
A couple years ago, there was a woman named Danielle Charette at Sluckport. I don't know if you remember what happened to. So basically, there was a trustees meeting going on, and a group of students who wanted to say something basically came in and interrupted the meeting.
Yeah.
And she basically said, like, well, these people should be called to order and like
Yeah.
this kind of stuff. And she was trying to like stand up and make her point, and she was just like, the 60 or so students who had come in to interrupt this trustees meeting just started like clapping to sort of drown her out. And like I read some stuff about like work you guys would do with like Hecklers videos.
Yeah.
Like, and basically I was just wondering like, what's your response to a time when a Hecklers video come up or will come up, or
Yeah.
like, what's your response to when people will sort of say like that's how things should be writ large, that like it's just community speaking,
Yeah.
establishing the norms of what to do.
Totally against it. And it's something that's really well illustrated in a book called The People's Darling Privilege by Michael Kent Curtis. And it talks about the original, not the Simpsons guy, but Reverend Lovejoy, for whom the Simpsons character is named, believe it or not, was an abolitionist publisher who was killed defending his printing press in 1837. And Michael Kent Curtis explains that as being a changing an attitude about the popular concept of freedom of speech in the United States. It wouldn't be a very strong legal concept for another 100 years, but that really changed the way Northerners and Americans thought about freedom of speech. That not only was it that the government sure as hell can't censor me, but that it also has a duty, and power has a duty to protect you from the mob killing you or censoring you. Within First Amendment law and within sort of the doctrine of freedom of speech, which are somewhat separate spheres, hecklers' vetoes are never okay. The idea of I don't like that person speaking here, and you show up and you shout them down and make it impossible for them to speak, I am completely against that, and I've said so a million different ways. Now there is a happy medium. I've given speeches where people have showed up with signs and banners that were, say things like free speech isn't hate speech is not free speech. And I'm like, okay, great. Thanks for protesting me. I support your right to do that. But it's a very different thing when you're actually saying that you can't speak here because my mob doesn't like you. And there's a really nasty, and it's well stated in case law, saying there's a really nasty feedback loop that you create, where basically when you allow a heckler's veto, you're saying, so basically we're only going to tolerate speech which is not unpopular with bottle throwers. That basically you create an incentive to engage in violence in some cases. Because if you make that, if that's the trick to shutting down the people you disagree with, unfortunately it's human nature that that's what people will do.
One more question?
Sure.
So the current controversy at Williams is Michael Bloomberg as our graduation speaker.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people want him disinvited because of stop and frisk or capitalism or other different objections. I mean, when do you think it's acceptable to disinvite a speaker? What should those guidelines be?
It's kind of funny. I've been really critical of disinvitation season. and it's actually sort of a term that we sort of jokingly use within FIRE, that come commencement time, typically, although they're not all commencement speakers, universities and students and faculty members will join together to demand that Speaker X be disinvited. And I want to be very clear, they have the right to do that. They absolutely have the right to do that. However, what it says about the way we talk to each other, I think, is negative. When your first impulse is, let's not have that person here, let's shut them down, let's get them disinvited, that's not, rather than let's confront them, let's hear them out, or even just the very old-fashioned idea of like, well, maybe they'll have something interesting to say that I haven't thought of. Which is real sort of epistemic humility, which is what scholarly thinking is actually supposed to be. Now, I'm totally with students who are just saying, I object to this, but don't want to get someone disinvited, but will protest outside. That's fine. But the disinvitation movement, I think, says something negative about our attitudes. And I might feel slightly differently if it just wasn't so damn common. And it's not just commencement. You know, like this year so far, disinvitation season started earlier than ever this year. The first one was that was Ray Kelly at Brown. And I have to point out, I'm a civil libertarian. Obviously, I disagree with stop and frisk. But what I think was so striking about this case was that because Ray Kelly knew he was so controversial, he agreed to an hour of question and answer after his debate. So if you really wanted to stick a hard question to Ray Kelly, he was there. He was going to be there, and they were going to be taking student questions, and there were students who were there like, I'm going to have it out with this dude. And that's great. That's what debate and discussion should be. But instead, when the students failed to get Ray Kelly disinvited, when the different student groups failed to get them disinvited, they shouted him down. So it made it impossible to actually carry on the speech. That is not, and some of the people who were angriest about it were the students who had those great killer questions for Ray Kelly. So this is happening more and more, and I don't if your first solution to this problem is get someone disinvited from your campus, I think you're just thinking about it the wrong way. Well, thank you for having me.